I worked as an Oregon County sheriff for over 3 decades. It was my entire life, but still a career. We got a call in of a lone single female who had actually been stranded because her red Ford pickup had broken down on Route 395. This was an issue that we had to go into, knowing that anything could happen here. After all this, we were trained to deal with different scenarios and situations, but females on their own always had to be one of the worst and most nerve-wracking scenarios. It was dark out around 1 o'clock in the morning, and she had been dialing in to say that she was all alone, felt scared, and the truck simply wasn't working. When she tried to turn it over, the engine had cut out and she had no idea what was going on. Thankfully, she hadn't crashed and had managed to just roll the car into the side, just offered the hard shoulder going onto the grass down on Slight Mound. I told them that we'd be on the way and told the first responders to stay on the line with her. I took my colleague me and Tom head up there, put our blue lights on, and get down there as fast as we possibly can. We get news in from the responders on the other line that she had hung up abruptly. They heard nothing, no noise, just a phone going dead. This in my eyes was a big red flag. I hit the gas as hard as I could and went for it as Tom prepared himself for the worst to jump straight out of the passenger side. We got within 2 miles of the predicted zone that this lady had broken down in. Finally, we find the red pickup. It was a fraud and it looked pretty messed up. This was totally contrary to what we were told, saying that she had somehow safely guided it to the one side. Now the biggest problem for us was finding this lady, not the vehicle. Tom got out the car and immediately scanned the horizon with his flashlight. We could see or hear nothing. There was little to no cars on this route at this point because of how early in the morning it was. There were still the odd car, obviously, but I have to say there was something eerie about being there, knowing that we were looking for a single alone lady who had now just vanished. After the line was completely taken down, the responders tried to track her cool, but there was no sign of where the cell would come from. After all this, we searched in the vehicle and around the surrounding area and embankment. The lady had completely vanished. There were no signs of her. We called in a couple canine units who also found no leads, no traces, and no sense anywhere. No direction from this vehicle was proving useful in any way whatsoever. The dogs were simply running around in circles, had no clue what they were even trying to track. This led our search and investigation onto passers-by. It was most likely that this lady, who was all alone, had been abducted, taken away by one of the vehicles passing by. This was what was in my mind as I was driving up and first heard this call from the first responders. When this incident was first filed, it was the first doubt that came into my mind, as it would be all officers with a scenario like this. This, however, was the worst case scenario, but it just so happened that a month later this lady was found. She had been found tied up in a man's house. This man just so happened to be wanted and had multiple warrants out for his arrest for being abusive and controlling towards women. It turns out he had overstepped the mark so bad and decided to completely abduct a stranger this time. Yes, he abused her, and there was evidence in the case which I can't go into too much now. Thankfully, we all got closure after that day, but we had a whole month of practically sleepless nights wondering if this lady was still alive somewhere out there. That's the issue with this job. Sometimes if you let your emotions get involved, it'll ruin your entire life. Story 2. I was out on a routine patrolling Carolina. Me and my sergeant, who was with me at the time, were trying to clock on and some people running a local drug gang. It wasn't anything professional, just some lower level type Class C drugs. After all this, we were doing our usual patrols around the neighborhood in the hood of the dark areas that we had been told were flagged up for trafficking and dealing. As we were driving round doing one of our monotone boring lap, we got a call come through on the radio. The call was by a neighbor. They were concerned about what was going on next door in the house opposite them. They claimed that apparently a woman had now been screaming, so we were called in for a domestic. It wasn't far too serious, it was just an investigation. The point was we were to call round and question, see what was going on and check the place out. So we did. Me and Sarge head over to the address and end up getting out of our car to see the neighbors stood out on their drive, confused, scared, in what looked like their night dress. And this was a lady, very old, maybe in her mid-70s. She was frail, pale, and extremely confused with what was going on. She was shaking as it was real cold out. She walked up to us in a panicky state, saying that her neighbor next door was causing loads of noise coming from the windows to her. It sounded like screams of desperation, but the seconds we got out of our patrol car, the inside heard absolutely nothing the whole time. On any type of investigation that we make based on allegations or claims, we must thoroughly look into all the sides, so we had to knock on this door and, unfortunately, wake anyone up who was inside. I walk up to the door and ring the bell, and give the door a couple knocks. I call police, open up through the door. My right hand was steady over my gun the whole time. I was worried, and in my left hand I had my light ready to blind, defend, or look simple. I was ready to do whatever was needed once that door was open. Domestics were one of the most unpredictable situations, and one of my most hated situations to be ever called to. This person wasn't answering the door, so once again I gave them a second warning, a good fun bang at the door, please open up, and then ringing the doorbell 5 or 6 times. Once again nobody answers, but this time I do hear the screams. They were loud and terrifying screams, as if a woman was screaming for her life at the top of her lungs, screams that sounded like she was being murdered in the very basement of her house. Me inside, draw weapons and got ready to check each other's shoulders as we head in, slowly checking every single room and clearing each room. We realize that there doesn't seem to be anyone in the house. There are a few more rooms we had to go through, and they were the upstairs rooms, so we proceeded to head on upstairs, this time staying as quiet as we could. We'd given the warnings 3 times, no one had replied, and for some reason the woman screaming wouldn't call for us or scream when we yelled out and gave the notice and warning of police in the building. I found this worrying, and to me it gave off all the signals of a hostage situation. Domestics, when turned very bad, tended to turn into domestic hostage situations. These were life or death situations, which require multiple units. Although my Sarge was experienced, I was leading the way, as he wanted me to do a lot of the work on the shifts to gain experience. I made my way upstairs and cleared every room. Once again Sarge kept me covering the landing of the hallway, and once again we came to one room left in the house. This was the bathroom. I go to clear the room, but the door's locked. As I twisted the doorknob, the lady began the screams. Once again they were abruptly stopped by what not like and sounded like someone muzzling her mouth. I could hear a male voice muttering, "Shut up, be quiet," violently trying to hold himself over her. I knew what this was, and so did my Sarge. His experience kicked in, and immediately he told me to not say anything and not try to handle again. We called him back up and got more units in, and got one of the hostage synthesizers to step in and try and get in the situation as soon as they possibly could, to limit the amount of harm, damage, and loss to this situation. The hostage specialist took over, and this time somehow managed to get this lady to come out. When we opened the door, it was a nightmare. There was blood everywhere. This man was the lady's ex. He had somehow broken into the house and had been torturing her in her own bathroom by slowly cutting her all over her body in mini nicks. This was excruciating pain, and probably one of the worst pains you can feel as a human being. The lady would pass out every 10 to 20 seconds and then regain consciousness. Every time she regained consciousness, she would begin screaming at the top of her lungs with the insane amount of pain her body was feeling. Somehow it was miraculous. She made a full recovery from over 300 scrape wounds, so these were entrances into her skin from the knife this man had been using. She get a full recovery, all without a single infection, although her body was left with scars, severe ones. She lived to tell the tale. This is the one out call that I had that affected me forever. Shootings, murders, thefts, you name it. After 40 years of being a cop, I'd been for it all. At the time of me telling you this story, I am now retired. I sit at my armchair, a big family and a loving wife. At the time it wasn't so easy to talk about, and I tell you right now, occasionally I'll have nightmares about what I saw that night. This man was evil and got decades in prison. Hopefully more men like this aren't born. This is pure sick, a psycho who seeks revenge on his ex just because she chose to not be with him anymore. Grandpa was a police officer back in the day. He worked murder cases and did detective work in his later career. One late night he was responding to a call of suspected shots fired at an old abandoned house. He and his partner were the closest to the house of everyone who received the dispatch call, so they ended up making it there first. When they reached the house, they found the gate through the backyard had been forced open, so they followed through. It was a shots fired, so they had their weapons drawn. As they approached a house, there was an unarmed man attempting to enter the house. The house was locked, but he was trying to smash his way through. My grandpa's partner chased after him. Here's the creepy part. My grandpa looked through the window at the house, thinking that maybe that guy was trying to get to someone on the inside. When he looks in, he vaguely sees someone standing and looking directly at him. My grandpa raises his weapon and says, "Please don't move." Simultaneously, the man inside appears to raise his own weapon. My grandpa gets extremely worried and Immediately realized he now had to get out of the line of sight. His adrenaline was pumping like crazy. He immediately starts yelling to the guy, "Drop the weapon." The man stays still, ridiculously still, and just says nothing. My grandpa takes cover to the right side of the window and radios Zenfir's partner, who has lost the man on foot. Before his partner returned, he pops back out from the right to try to advance, expecting the man to have gone away and found a place to hide. So with his weapon drawn, he jumps out and looks inside, but when he looks into the window with his weapon drawn, there the man is still hazy dark and pointing his weapon directly at him. The guy hadn't moved at all. It's silent for what seems like forever. My grandpa shouts again, "Drop the weapon," and gets on the ground. He told me that he's never felt adrenaline like this in his entire life, even during his entire career as a police officer. His hand was shaking to the point where he was almost dropping his gun. My grandpa says that at this point he begins to believe it's something else. Any normal human would have run away if a police officer drew their weapon and pointed it directly at them. What he saw before didn't run, and at second glances when he peeked his head over the window, it was still there. Then he sees that the assailant is wearing a badge. He said that this freaked him out big time as he realized this could have possibly been his partner, made it inside the house and was just joking with him, or even worse, trying to find the guy that had now run inside from another entrance. Once more he said, "Drop your weapon and get on the ground." The ghost man also motioned with his pistol, and at this point in the story my grandpa says it best, "I got myself quirked up over my own dying reflection." And that's the story of how my grandpa almost crapped himself over his own reflection. On the third time of him standing up and looking through the window frame, he realized that this was an extremely dark reflection of a mirror in the backside of one of the bedrooms. He was looking at himself the whole time, and clearly the adrenaline or the release of hormones had tainted any sense of his logical thinking or perception skills. He was embarrassed after that evening and felt bad. He didn't even want to tell anyone. After what had happened, this was unprofessional to say the least, and even to this day he still does joke about this, but to him it's still one of his worst stories. One of the most disturbing things that ever happened to me was when I was walking on a beat solo on the footpath late at night. This was back in my first year on the job. My partner was on a meal break, so it left me on the post by myself for the next hour until he got back. I decided to walk down from the north of my post to the south past a few abandoned lots. As I passed one of them, I thought I saw something at the end of the lot by the fence line. Lots of times people using or just being vagrant will be in these areas. I decided to shine my flashlight on the area, but I saw nothing. I thought to myself, no big deal, but as I turn away, the fence on the far side of the lot rattled, giving that distinctive chain sound. I stopped and looked back, already thinking of how ridiculous this feels, and I put my light on there again. Standing there the second time, I was lucky. There was a man. He didn't look homeless, nor did he look like the kind of guy that hangs out in lots late at night. I was a bit confused. I asked him what he was doing. He simply stood there, not really looking at me, but just kind of above me, as if he was gazing at something above my head. I asked him again, but he didn't answer either. I told him to come over, as he shouldn't be in the lot, but he ignored me and just stood there. I decided to put it over the radio before approaching him, so I walk into the lot, but I have to hop a fence to get to where he is standing. I figured this guy must be tweaking out or something. He looks like he has no idea where he is. It's always best to have your partner with you, especially in situations when you're unknown, but the sheer fact that my colleague was on a meal break, I couldn't exactly just press the emergency button over something that clearly wasn't an emergency yet, so I hopped the fence and looked back. This guy had disappeared the second I looked down and tried to land my feet on the ground after hopping the fence. I looked up expecting him to be there, but he had vanished. In those short 2 to 3 seconds, he had somehow moved himself completely within 10 to 15 meters. Now to me that seems outright impossible, even for the likes of someone like Usain Bolt. I took my eyes off of him for 2 seconds and he was gone. There was no sound from the fair fence chain. There was nothing. So he definitely didn't climb that, because these were the type of fences that made a lot of noise even when you simply touched them and put a little bit of weight onto them. So there I stood after just hopping the fence. I was now scanning the entire lot, wondering where this guy had gone. I looked behind the only real cover, which was a dumpster, and I even looked inside of it, but he wasn't there. Central raised me a minute later and asked for my status over the radio. I told him that there was no crime corrected, and then I was just resuming patrol. To this day I saw a ghost. I guess as crazy as that sounds, there's no way of putting it down to anything else. I've never told anyone about what happened that night. It was pretty crazy, I know. There is a chance that maybe he just hopped the fence without me hearing it and took off like mad, but he would have been one heck of a fast dude to do it, and he was wearing some heavy-duty boots, jeans, and what are like a smart polo jumper. In that amount of time it took him to hop a 4-foot fence wearing those clothes in 2 maybe 3 seconds maximum. It was highly unlikely, and I know for certain that. Story 3. I saw that guy who is sitting monitoring a stop sign late at night. It was somewhere around 2 to 3 in the morning. The area was dead, there were no cars out, and there was no one to be seen. It was my job to basically do the night shift, and I absolutely hated it. But I had to do it for the experience and to try and get myself off the ranks. The area was notoriously known for a gruesome murder they had still gone unsolved to the day I was sat there. While sitting there, I noticed something shoot across the back of my car in my rear view mirror. I was a bit confused, as surely I knew that something didn't move that fast that were human car, and then across the front of my car. This creeped me out big time, and I kept looking around trying to find what it was. I turned all my spotlights on, including the side ones, and even used my flashlight to shine the beam out of the windows. I saw nothing, there was no one. Still, the sidewalk, the road, everywhere was empty. Creeped out, I realized it was my time to move on from this area. Our video cameras in the cars are set to turn on automatically at certain speeds, so it turned on. I decided to review the camera to see if something really did cross into my path during the point where something should have run through in front of the camera. When I saw the shadow, the camera cut out. It went dark for around 2 seconds and then switched back on me. My sergeant or my chief couldn't explain what happened, and they just put it down to the cameras being faulty and ended up getting a new set on the squad car. To this day, I still think it was something a bit more creepy, but I don't know. Story 4. Me and my partner were called to a welfare check. 2 young boys had not shown up at school for over a week now, so it was reported to us, and we were given the job to head on down to their address and check out the reasons why they weren't there. Usually when kids don't turn up to school, the parents will give a reason, whether it be illness, whether it be some commitments, holidays, etc. However, for these 2 boys there was nothing. The school even tried contacting them every day for one of the weeks to no avail, so we arrive at the boys' apartment and hear noises from the inside. Immediately we thought this might have been a domestic, but we couldn't really understand. Still, no one was responding to the calls. Even at this point we had no idea what to expect. Cost of receiving permission from the HQ. Eventually, after multiple knocks at the door with no one's coming through, we could continually hear noises and yelling from inside the apartment, yet no one was answering the door to us. So we eventually broke in and find the apartment filled with garbage, and a bottle of human waste in the corner of the living room. On the sofa was the mother. She was dead from an overdose. There was also a man who was running down the hallway half naked and shouting how it was the second coming of Jesus and that all sinners were going to die. It took both me and my partner to restrain this guy and get him on the floor. At one point we almost had to use our teasers because of the strength of this guy, who is also clearly on the same drugs that it just killed his wife. Eventually backup arrives, take the man away. Now it's our job to find these other people that we are supposed to find. I can't remember what age they were in. I don't think we were even told which grade they were in. All we knew is that there were 2 young boys who weren't even teenagers yet, so eventually we decided to walk about and try and find where they are. Searching the apartment, we eventually found these guys. They were both locked in their shared bedroom the entire time, but initially we only found one boy. He had been locked in there the entire time, so we're talking a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. He had no food, what looked like no drinking water, and no bathroom. Like I said earlier, there was only one of them, but on the reports and the calls we had there were supposed to be 2. After this, the mother was taken away, the father was taken away to prison and arrested. The young child went to live with his grandmother, but it took us actually searching the entire apartment thoroughly, even to the point of trying to call him forensics to find where this second boy had got to. It turns out that he had died and they had put his body in the mattress that the other boy was sleeping on. This boy was sleeping on his brother for nights, without food, water, or a bathroom, while his father ran about the hallway half naked, screaming religious scripture, and his mother lay there dead from an overdose on the living room sofa. Some people are dealt a bad hand, and this was by far my most eerie and creepy response to date. Story 5. I've been called to a disturbance downtown from a person that apparently was running about screaming the head off. I didn't know what to expect, but I've been told on the way there by the unit that apparently they had actually been trying to make off in their own car. At first people thought this was a stolen car, but it turns out they most likely Thought this guy was just tripping out and that he was just trying to drive. When I arrived, I saw sure enough this guy was in his car but couldn't start it. He looked completely frantic, panicking, and just all over the place. He kept screaming and holding his ears. I parked my vehicle up on the edge of the sidewall. It turns out this guy was in his car just outside some big warehousing unit, so I went in there because apparently that was from the company that made the call to the dispatcher. I told the guy to sit tight, and it was quite obvious that he wasn't going to run off. He was so badly tripping that he couldn't even start his own car, and was trying to start his car by twisting the steering wheel. I knew I needed to keep him in place though, so I decided to shut his door and told him to hold tight while I went in and spoke to some of the guys. I asked the guys in the warehouse to come out with me, seeing as I had no other unit to keep an eye on this dude, who was pretty unpredictable to say the least. So as I had the employees from this warehouse come out, they were describing to me how this guy had run around the sidewalk in the street, screaming for the past hour. They had no idea what on earth to do because they didn't know who this guy was and no one knew what he wanted. Apparently he had also been trying to start his car for the last 20 minutes, but he had failed the whole time, also screaming and yelling while sat in his car. Eventually, while I'm talking to these guys, I look over and still the units haven't arrived to back me up. I definitely needed at least one other dude, as I knew arresting this guy may end up being pretty tricky, considering while depending what he was actually taking some drugs and overdoses can be impossible to restrain because it just gives these people unlimited strength, sometimes strength that he can withstand hazes and purpose ray to a certain degree, so it would take manpower. And I definitely didn't want to trigger off this guy who is clearly at the height of his trip. He was big as well. Now I hadn't seen him standing because he was sat in his car, but I could just tell this guy was where the 6 foot. His head was practically touching the roof of the car, sat inside, and he was a pretty well strong built dude. He must have been in his early 40s. He had crazy like hair, and as he sat there he picked something out of his glove box. I wasn't paying perfect attention, but I noticed he did pick something out of his glove box because the screaming stopped for a while. I'd been there, and during the whole time I had been there he had been screaming 100 of the time, but this time he went silent. He gained my attention, but I was still listening to the employee at one ear while I tried to focus on this guy with the other. I noticed that this guy had gone into his glove box and grabbed what looked like to be a pen knife. He flipped it open, and yes, what he did next really shocked me. He took the pen knife to his ear and began cutting his ear off. I didn't get to him in time, but by the time I got around to his driver's side door and had drawn my taser, he had cut one of his entire ears off. So as you can imagine, this car had now turned into a bloodbath with the wound spraying out blood and an ear on the passenger side seat. The weird thing about this was I was expecting that I would certainly have to now tase this guy and take him down all by myself. At this point I immediately pressed the emergency button and tried to call for any backup nearest to the vicinity. When he had cut his ear off, his whole demeanor and attitude changed. It was like he became a whole different person. He stepped out the door, he put his hands on his head, knelt down and lied flat on his stomach. He put his hands behind his back and complied 100%. I'd never had such a bizarre standoff with any criminal or anyone in the history of my career, and upon looking into it, when the investigators got done searching this guy and testing him, it turns out he had had a crazy trip on PCP, and apparently he was hearing flashing, or how he described it, but more like hissing and beeping noises in one of his ears. According to him, when he cut his ear off, the noises stopped. And that is why you don't do drugs